The human passed the Valdris Test. That's not possible. Check the scores again. The Valdris Test had existed for 61 years, and it had been designed by General Orith Valdris of the Kale Dross Strategic Command as a single-day evaluation of combat decision-making under conditions of extreme resource constraint, information deprivation, and cascading failure. The test was not designed to be passed. It was designed to identify at the point of failure where an officer's decision-making broke down. The score was not a pass or fail number. It was a diagnostic, a detailed map of exactly how a candidate judgment collapsed under sufficient pressure, and at what point and for what reason in 61 years, and no candidate had completed all 7 phases without a disqualifying decision. The closest anyone had come was a Kale Dross senior officer named Commander Vel 12 years ago, and who had completed 6 of the 7 phases before making a resource allocation decision in the final scenario that the evaluation board had reviewed for 3 days before concluding narrowly that it was disqualifying. And Commander Vel had gone on to become one of the most decorated officers in the Keth fleet. His 6-phase completion was considered, in the military community that knew about the test, to be the definitive upper limit of what was achievable, and the test was administered annually at the Coalition Joint Academy on Station Dorn. Participation was by invitation only, extended to candidates who had already completed standard senior officer evaluation at the top of their cohort. 12 invitations per year. In 61 years, the test had been administered to 732 candidates across 23 species. Humans had received 4 invitations in the 12 years since they became eligible. The 4th invitation had gone to a man named Kale Dross. Welcome to Sci-fi universe, where the galaxy keeps setting records it wasn't expecting to have broken. Hit subscribe right now because this one goes exactly where the title says it goes. Let's start from the beginning. Kale Dross was 29 years old. He had spent 4 years on frontier active service before entering the officer track, which was unusual, and his service record from those 4 years contained enough material that the officer who processed his academy application had flagged it for review before approving it, and because the numbers seemed high for someone of his age and rank, and the reviewer wanted to confirm they were accurate. The frontier he had served on was not the comfortable kind, and the outer settlements operated in a different register from the academy environment. Resource constraints were real rather than simulated. Communications blackouts were environmental rather than designed, and the gap between a correct decision and an incorrect one had consequences that showed up in ways that were not easily filed under performance metrics. 4 years in that environment did not produce the same officer that 4 years of pre-academy coursework produced. It produced something different, and not necessarily better in every way, but different in ways that were difficult to measure with the standard tools. At the academy, Kale had conducted himself with the specific quality of someone focused on the work and not particularly interested in the surrounding institutional architecture. And he completed his evaluations, attended his seminars, and engaged in the kind of precise, minimal social interaction that suggested he understood the environment he was in without feeling the need to perform for it. He was not unfriendly. He was simply, as one of his instructors had written in an assessment, operating at a register that the standard evaluation metrics were not fully calibrated to measure. The Valdris Test invitation came at the end of his 2nd year. He read it, confirmed his attendance, and asked the administrative office 2 questions: the reporting time and whether food was provided during the evaluation day. Since it ran for approximately 14 hours, food was provided. He thanked them and returned to his coursework. General Yeth, who oversaw the Valdris Test administration and had done so for 9 years, reviewed the candidate list for the current cycle and paused when he reached Kale's name. He pulled the file, read it again, and then called his evaluation coordinator into the office and told her to make sure the recording systems in all 7 phase rooms were fully operational. Because he had a feeling they were going to want the documentation, she asked why. He said he wasn't sure yet. Just a feeling. He had learned, in 9 years of running the test, that certain files produced a feeling, not a prediction, not a conclusion, just a sense that the standard framing of the day might not be the framing that held. He had been wrong before. He had also been right before, and he told the coordinator to check the systems and did not elaborate further. Check the systems. All 7 phase rooms were fully operational. She also, on her own initiative, set up a secondary recording feed for Phase 7, specifically the phase that had ended every previous attempt, because if something was going to happen, she wanted 2 angles on it. The Valdris Test began at 0600. 12 candidates, 7 phases, and 1 evaluation board observing via recording systems throughout. The candidates did not interact with each other during the test. Each phase was administered individually in a sealed environment with no information carried between phases except what the candidate retained in their own memory from previous scenarios. Phase 1 was a command decision scenario. A deteriorating tactical situation, 3 subordinate units, communications degrading, and 2 possible courses of action with incomplete information supporting either. The phase was designed to measure how candidates handled uncertainty, whether they committed to a decision with insufficient data, or stalled waiting for clarity that was not coming, Kale made his decision in 4 minutes. The evaluation board noted the time. The average decision point for this phase across 61 years of data was 11 minutes. The decisions made faster than average were not automatically better decisions, but the evaluation board noted the time because it was notable. His decision was correct, and the evaluation coordinator sitting beside General Yeth in the observation room glanced at the timestamp on the recording and said nothing. She wrote it down. Phase 2 introduced resource scarcity, and the scenario placed the candidate in command of a unit that had lost 40% of its projected supply chain with an operational timeline that did not accommodate the loss. The phase measured whether candidates recalculated the mission, requested additional resources they were not going to receive, or found a third option that the scenario designers had included but that most candidates did not identify. In 61 years, approximately 1 in 8 candidates found the third option. Of those, most found it late after spending time on the first 2 approaches and arriving at the third by elimination. And Kale found the third option in 9 minutes. He then spent 3 additional minutes testing it for failure modes before committing, which the evaluation board also noted, because identifying the option was one thing and checking it was another. Most candidates who found the third option committed to it immediately. The stress testing was not required. He did it anyway. Phase 3 was communications blackout, no contact with command, no contact with allied units, and a developing situation that required a response and no external guidance available to inform what that response should be. Kale responded. Documented his reasoning in the mission log in a format that was clear enough that the evaluation board, reviewing it afterward, could follow his decision tree precisely. This was not required by the test. The test required a response, not an explanation. He explained anyway, in the specific way of someone who understood that a decision made in isolation was only as good as the record of why it was made. By the end of Phase 4, the evaluation board had stopped watching the candidates in rotation and had moved to watching Kale's feed continuously. General Yeth, in the observation room, said nothing. He had the expression of a man watching something he had been told was not going to happen. And Phase 5 was the breaking point for most candidates. It had been specifically designed to be the breaking point. The scenario involved a situation where every available option had a significant cost attached to it, no clean choices, no solutions that didn't require sacrificing something. And the phase measured not whether a candidate could find a good solution, but how they handled the reality that there wasn't one, and what they chose to prioritize when everything had a price. Most candidates at this phase either stalled or made a decision that the evaluation board could clearly identify as driven by the desire to find a clean answer that did not exist. Both were disqualifying responses for different reasons, stalling because command did not wait, clean answer seeking because the galaxy did not offer them. And in 61 years, Phase 5 had disqualified more candidates than any other single phase. Not because it was the most technically complex, because it was the most psychologically honest. It asked candidates to make a decision that was going to cost something, knowing it was going to cost something, and to own that cost rather than pretend it wasn't there. Most people, even good officers, found that harder than they expected. Kale spent 2 minutes at the beginning of Phase 5 reading through the scenario parameters. Then he spent 3 minutes doing something that the evaluation recording captured clearly but that took the reviewing officers a moment to identify. He was listing the costs, not looking for a way to avoid them, listing them in order of magnitude, deciding which ones he could accept and which ones he couldn't, and which ones, in the absence of a better option, he was going to have to accept anyway. Then he made his decision. It was not a clean answer. It was not meant to be. It was a decision that acknowledged clearly what it cost and chose to pay that cost for documented reasons. The evaluation board reviewed it for 40 minutes before the senior assessor set down her notes and said to the room generally, "That is a correct response to an incorrect situation." Nobody disagreed. Phase 6 was a leadership assessment under fire. The scenario placed the candidate in command of a unit whose members were operating at the edge of their capability with a mission that required more than the unit currently had available. The phase measured not tactical decision-making, but the specific kind of judgment required to get more out of people than they believed they had without burning them out, without making promises that couldn't be kept, without pretending the situation was better than it was. This phase failed candidates in a different way than Phase 5. Phase 5 failed people who couldn't accept hard truths. Phase 6 failed people who couldn't communicate them, who either oversold the situation to maintain morale and lost credibility when the reality showed up, or undersold it to be honest and lost the unit's willingness to attempt the mission at all. The balance was not teachable in a classroom. It was the kind of thing learned in environments where getting it wrong had real consequences, and Kale handled it in a way that the evaluation board would later describe in their assessment notes as unconventional in method, conventional in result. He did not give a speech. He did not project confidence he didn't have. He told the unit clearly and without softening it what the situation was, and then he told them what he needed from them. Then he told them why he thought they could do it, with specific reasons rather than general encouragement. 2 of the 3 unit commanders in the scenario responded better than the scenario designers had projected. The 3rd responded exactly as projected. And Kale adjusted for the 3rd. Phase 7 was the final scenario, the one that had stopped Commander Vell 12 years ago, the one that no candidate had completed in 61 years of the test. And it was a cascading failure scenario, a situation in which decisions made correctly in previous phases had downstream consequences that the candidate had not been able to anticipate. And those consequences were now compounding in real time and requiring the candidate to respond to a crisis that was partly of their own making. With the resources they had left after 6 previous phases, the phase was designed to be demoralizing. The intent was not to punish candidates for correct earlier decisions, but to measure how they handled the specific experience of having done everything right and still arriving at a difficult place. Whether they recalibrated or whether they spent time and energy responding to the situation they had expected instead of the one they had. Kale looked at the scenario parameters for Phase 7 for 45 seconds. Then he said, to the room he was alone in, quietly and without particular drama, and then he worked. The evaluation board reviewed his Phase 7 completion for 2 days, not because the result was unclear, and the result was clear. He had completed all 7 phases without a disqualifying decision, and they reviewed it for 2 days because 61 years of institutional expectation required that kind of processing time when it was contradicted by a single candidate on a Tuesday morning in Room 7 of the Joint Command Academy on Station Dorn. On the first day they reviewed the recordings, all 7 phases in sequence in full. The senior assessor made notes. The 2 junior assessors made notes. General Yeth watched without making notes, and because he had already formed his conclusion during the live observation and was using the review to look for something that would require him to change it. He did not find anything. On the second day they reviewed the decision documentation, the logs Kale had kept throughout the evaluation, and the reasoning he had recorded in Phase 3 when documentation was not required, the cost listing from Phase 5 that had taken the assessors a moment to recognize for what it was. They reviewed the Phase 6 recording again specifically, watching the interaction with the unit commanders, and watching the adjustment for the 3rd unit commander who had responded as projected rather than better than projected. The senior assessor said at the end of the second day he didn't treat the test like a test. Nobody asked her to elaborate. They all understood what she meant. Most candidates, even the best ones, approached the Valdris test as an evaluation to be performed well. A high-stakes assessment with a known format and a scoring system, and the goal was to score well on it. That framing was not wrong, but it introduced a layer of performance between the candidate and the decisions and awareness of being watched, of being assessed, that subtly shaped the responses. Kale had treated each phase as the situation it described, not as a scenario to navigate correctly, but as a problem to solve. And the documentation in Phase 3 wasn't performed for the evaluators, it was how he thought. The cost listing in Phase 5 wasn't a demonstration of mature decision-making, it was his actual process. The evaluation board could see the difference in the recordings. It was not in what he did, and it was in how he moved through it. General Yeth wrote the assessment report himself, which he had not done in 9 years of overseeing the test. It was 4 pages. The summary at the front was 1 paragraph. The paragraph noted that the candidate had demonstrated, across all 7 phases, a specific quality that the test was designed to identify at the point of its absence. That in 61 years of administering the evaluation, the board had become expert at documenting where and how decision-making failed under pressure. That this cycle had produced for the first time a complete data set showing what it looked like when it did not. He also noted in the final line that the candidate had asked whether food was provided during the evaluation day. It had been, Yeth wrote, a reasonable question. The evaluation ran 14 hours, and the candidate had clearly intended to need the full 14 hours. He had used 13 and a half, the remaining half hour per the evaluation record he had spent eating lunch. The title of this story says Kale had done it twice. That is correct. The first time was the cycle just described, and the second time was the following year, when General Yeth, having spent 12 months reviewing the Phase 7 documentation and revising the scenario to close what he had identified as a potential gap in the cascading failure parameters, reissued an invitation to Kale for the updated version of the test. The invitation was unusual, and no candidate had ever been invited twice. The test was designed as a one-time evaluation. Yeth issued the invitation anyway because he had spent a year updating the test specifically in response to what one candidate had done to it, and he wanted to know whether the update held. And Kale read the invitation, confirmed his attendance, asked the same 2 questions, reporting time and whether food was provided. He completed the updated version in 14 hours and 2 minutes, slightly longer than the first attempt which Yeth had expected, and because revised Phase 7 was meaningfully harder than the original, his food arrived cold this time. He ate it anyway. Yeth reviewed the second completion for 1 day, not 2. He had already done the processing time the first cycle. This time he simply wrote the report, noted the result, and added one line at the bottom that was not standard evaluation language. It said, "Recommend no further revisions to the Valdris test on the basis of this candidate's performance. The test is functioning correctly. The candidate is simply better at it than the test was designed to accommodate." And he submitted the report. Then he closed the file, then he opened it again, read that last line one more time and left it in. That is the story for today. Drop a comment and tell me which phase do you think was hardest for Kale. Because I have my own answer, and I want to know if yours matches mine. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to a growing channel. And if you are not subscribed to HFY Universe yet, do it now. New stories every week, and the next one is already being written. Until then, stay human, even when the test wasn't designed for you to pass, especially then.